Hi all, we're thinking strategically about culture today, so let's get started. Have you ever wondered why some organizations that seem to have everything going for them, a good product, strong profile, smart people, fall short of their full potential? The answer may be in their organizational cultures, the attitudes, mindsets, and habits that shape interactions and systems. In this three-part series, we're going to address organizational culture and how, with a little strategy, it can be shaped to create an organization that recognizes and addresses its gaps and capitalizes on strengths. This installment, the first, begins with an overview of organizational culture. What is it? How does it influence our organizations and interactions? It will also provide you with a very simple framework for thinking about culture. In subsequent presentations, we'll cover how to create a plan for culture shaping and how to get others on board with your plan. Before we go any further, I'll introduce myself. I'm Jill Person. I've worked in a number of companies and nonprofit organizations, rising from the front desk to management positions. I've seen culture, the good, the bad, the ugly, from every angle, and I am fascinated by it. Whether I was in a corporate setting or a nonprofit, the unifying thread throughout my career was how deeply my work environments influenced my own attitudes, relationships, and performance, and vice versa. And I saw the same two-way effect on my colleagues. I've seen even how small changes in personnel, policy, messaging, decision-making, mission, etc., can have a ripple effect through an entire department or organization, sometimes for the better, but sometimes not. This series of presentations is the culmination of my graduate studies at North Park University. I hope you find it engaging to follow and helpful as you work toward shaping your organization's culture. So what is organizational culture? Many of us know it when we see it, but it's not always easy to name. I think the simplest definition comes from the Business Dictionary online. That is simply the values and behaviors that contribute to the unique social and psychological environment of an organization. Regardless of the words we use to define it, we've all seen culture in action. We see it in the conduct at the top of the hierarchy and in how employees and customers and the larger community are treated. Are workers compensated competitively? Are they treated with respect and appreciation? How connected is the organization to its stakeholders? Does it seem responsive or out of touch? These behaviors are harder to fake than we typically think. We see it in the attitudes that dictate how much collaboration can and will occur in decision making and creative endeavors. People are the secret weapon of every organization. A healthy culture will cultivate ideas at every level. It will also recognize that diversity of ideas comes from diversity of people in their backgrounds, talents, and skills. Another area where we see how culture is expressed is in expression itself. The way an organization communicates power structures and controls the flow of information is telling. Have you ever worked somewhere in which the higher-ups were always in closed-door meetings, never explaining or engaging employees in the crisis or opportunity of the moment? How did it feel to be kept out of the loop? In the past, when I've been on the silent end of such situations, I worried about my job security and questioned the reliability of what little information I did get from my superiors. I did not trust people, and it affected my commitment to my job and willingness to pitch in. Morale is an important indicator of culture, by the way, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that later. Finally, culture is seen in the way people work together. Do they function as a well-oiled machine, or does the team never seem to gel? A lack of teamwork across the board is both a performance and a morale problem, and it likely comes from above, from the behaviors, attitudes, and communication styles of an organization's leaders. Ultimately, organizational culture shows up in the interlaced relationships between leaders, workers, and customers, and the interactions that flow between these groups, as seen in this diagram. The truth is, you could plug in any number of words into the various segments, and you'll still say something important about culture. That's how all-encompassing it is. So I love this quote. For me, it sums everything up. And here's a story that I think gets to the heart of it. A friend of mine was promoted to a role leading a team that consistently fell short of its goals, and that created a ripple effect for other departments that relied on this group. Her bosses were sure that a lack of strategy was at fault, but my friend saw issues with the communications between supervisors and employees, as well as between the team and other departments. She also found that some team members were underdeveloped while others were simply phoning it in. It was also unclear how decisions were made or who they were being made by, especially when it came to setting team priorities and assigning projects. Before introducing new work procedures and production strategies, she knew she had to address the team's culture. So her plan did meet with some resistance from above, but she was given a chance to go forward. And in the first year, some people left the team, others were promoted, and some new folks were brought on. Now, in her second year heading this group, my friend's team is meeting its benchmarks and is one of the company's highest rated groups for employee satisfaction. They may or may not have had a strategy problem when she began, but they definitely had a culture problem. And when your organizational culture is dysfunctional, it doesn't matter how good your strategic plan is. Culture is the air your strategy breathes. So identifying organizational culture can be elusive even when it's in good shape. There are a number of things, though, that may point to dysfunction. Here are a few. So if your organization or a particular department is consistently having trouble meeting deadlines or quality standards, you should look first to your culture. It may be that your environment doesn't support your benchmarks, or that you didn't consider all of the necessary factors and conditions when setting them. I once worked for a company as part of a team onboarding hundreds of new accounts that were acquired through a merger. The senior leadership determined it would take about 6 months, and they planned staff layoffs, financial goals, benchmarks accordingly. The whole project ended up taking about 2 years. Another way to look at your organizational culture is through the lens of your mission. Mission statements often use optimistic words like improve and inclusive. Do these sentiments translate into the behaviors and attitudes of your workforce, especially those at the top who set the tone for everyone else? The way you conduct business, the way you treat people, and yes, this includes employees and contractors, should align with your stated mission, vision, and values. This next one might be a little more surprising. How is your staff's creativity level? Are people bringing you ideas? Do brainstorming sessions feel more like meetings where you just assign tasks and everyone else just walks away quietly? It's unlikely no one in the organization has a thought or an opinion. They've just given up on sharing anything with their bosses. Every profession and industry needs new ideas to keep going. If your organization is turned into a place where creativity goes to die, you could use some culture shaping. Here are a few more things to look for. I mentioned this one earlier, low morale. We've all seen this at some point. When entire teams or organizations seem to just be going through the motions, something's in need of a change, and that something is the culture. Hand in hand with morale is staff turnover. How many people resigned or retired from your organization in the past year? How does that number compare to previous years or similar organizations? And I don't know, you may not have thought of this one. Where did they go? If they made lateral moves, took lower level positions, retired a few years too early, or left without sharing their future plans, look to your organizational culture, but be prepared. It's not going to be in good shape. Customer feedback can also be a sign that your organizational culture is in need of improvement. There will always be complaints. But similar to employee turnover, ask yourself a few questions. Have the numbers consistently crept up in recent years? And what's the nature of the complaints? Are longtime customers noticing a drop in quality? Does it take multiple conversations and contacts to resolve issues? One of my favorite examples of how corporate culture can spark amazing service is that of the Ritz-Carlton hotels. You may have heard of this. Every employee is permitted to spend up to a certain amount per day. When the program started, it was $2,000 to resolve guest issues without consulting management. There might be more money now after several years, but you get the idea. Frontline employees often know what your customers need better than anyone else. Empower them to take care of the more easily solvable issues, and you're going to have satisfied customers and workers while speeding up the whole process. Communications. So that job I mentioned earlier in which our account onboarding process went awry, it's because the senior leaders made staffing decisions without consulting department heads or learning about the needs of the incoming accounts. My team lost half of its workforce during the first few months of the process, and customer complaints shot up. Decisions were made without consultation or information gathering. We lost hundreds of thousands of dollars, not to mention customer confidence in the process. Which leads me to this next point. Your employees are your greatest resource. If your organization is not consistently keeping the staff informed of company initiatives, policy changes, and news, both good and bad, or if it isn't involving employees in decision making, you have a very serious problem with your organizational culture. Any of these elements can indicate a counterproductive culture, and in combination, it's pretty much a certainty. The key is to look for patterns. Even small ones can spread and grow. Peter Senge literally wrote the book on identifying where things go amiss in organizations and how to get things back on track. Because culture is something that often develops and devolves slowly, his theory of systems archetypes can be especially useful in thinking about culture. I encourage you to look it up. So now that you're looking at your culture in a new light and perhaps identifying areas for improvement, let's shift to thinking about shaping culture for the better. I've already mentioned how a lack of alignment between your practices and your mission can lead back to issues with culture. Going back to that, consider exactly where things don't match up. Living up to your organization's mission, vision, and values begins with how you conduct business and treat the people you employ. If these elements aren't fully aligned, it's something you'll want to address when you begin to develop a plan to shape your culture. Your culture is affecting how things work today, but any changes you make will also have a long-term impact. Don't look for solutions that will require significant sacrifices from your current leaders and workers in the hope of a payoff later on. That approach speaks to the very heart of dysfunctional culture. Justifying or tolerating poor treatment of people, again, your greatest resource, by saying it's for the greater good is short-sighted. There's no guarantee you'll succeed, and it's plainly ridiculous. And that's a nice segue for this next point. Start talking to people in all areas and at all levels. You might be surprised at how insightful people are and how much they care about the success of the organization. I've always believed that receptionists and administrative assistants are an organization's secret weapon. They see and hear almost everything. They're the face of the organization for most customers, and yet are rarely asked to contribute ideas and insights. Suggestion boxes don't really count here. They can be useful in other contexts, but the passive nature of a suggestion box doesn't communicate direct interest in or respect for individual staffers. Finally, combine your data with your insights. A friend of mine who works in fundraising describes it as a blend of art and science, and he is right. Not just about his own profession, but about most. Statistics on performance, productivity, customer satisfaction, and the like are enriched by your observations and gut feelings, and vice versa. Once you've started viewing organizational culture with a more strategic eye, I'm sure you'll find even more ways to identify issues and work toward improvement. These tips may turn out to be all that you need, but if not, they are a good place to start. I hope you found this video helpful and informative, and it gets you thinking about your organization's culture in a strategic way. Whether the concepts and recommendations I've shared are new to you or simply reinforce what you already suspected, feel free to use my presentation as a resource and build on it with your own learning and ideas. Now that you've begun to develop a strategic mindset toward organizational culture, it's time to work on a plan to reshape that culture. I hope you'll join me in the next video for part 2, Designing Culture. If you'd like more information about this presentation, including references, you'll find a link to an information doc in the video details below. Thank you so much for joining me today.